ESPN picks up the ACC media option, obviously extending the contract with the ACC through 2036. Some other stuff that came out in conjunction with ESPN picking up the media option was that some of the uneven revenue distributions that the ACC is currently considering doing a brand fund, where whatever that means, how much ever amount of money that will be, and then obviously the uneven distribution revenue that they've already talked about before. Jordan, obviously everybody out there in the college football world knows that Clemson and Florida State are both litigating against their conference currently, the ACC. What does this do to those lawsuits? Does this point further down the direction of there will be some sort of mediation take place and some sort of settlement eventually between all parties, and Clemson and Florida State will stay in the ACC for the time being, whatever that time period is? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is very much an important start to heading towards mediation and getting a settlement. There have been talks about how they're going to go and go about, coming about that settlement, because one of the main gripes that Florida State and especially Clemson, in Clemson's case, is the exorbitant exit fee and the cut of the deal that they're getting. That's something that's still being worked out, but very much has been in the conversation. And I think, with everything that's gone on and some of the more less interesting parts of the trial, it's kind or court case, it's been pretty obvious that this is the direction they're going to be headed in. They've agreed, I believe, 3 times to delay discovery. They've been pushing that back. There clearly seems to be a reluctance from both parties involved to get to that phase, because that's when you got to start, digging up some skeletons, releasing some information that they would rather not have public. So this is a kind of the area where I think that ultimately we're going to head down is. I think you're going to see Clemson and Florida State find some sort of settlement. There's been talks about, reducing the exit fee for when the media contracts of the SEC and the Big Ten and the Big 12 are up in 2031. I believe they're all up in 2031.
Yeah.
And there's obviously talks about incentive-based, revenue sharing and brand revenue sharing, which is something that would be a first in college athletics. In terms of like the amount of people that watch you determines your cut of the or slice of the cake. So all of that is kind of things that are being in discussions right now, but it's clear that Clemson is and Florida State are likely going to remain in the ACC,
Right.
at least for the foreseeable future. But I do think that this has, while the lawsuits certainly haven't led to an exit strategy, there does seem to be, some giving from the ACC side of things as far as, restructuring how they go about rewarding their biggest brands, and hopefully could keep Clemson and Florida State in a competitive earning market with the SEC and the Big Ten. Maybe, not necessarily making the same amount of money that those schools are making, but, making sure the gap doesn't widen significantly to the point where it becomes like impossible to compete. So this is one of those things that, outsiders are going to view as hot. We told you you're not going to get out of the ACC, and Clemson and Florida State are stuck in all that. But this is an opportunity for both of those schools and Miami and the other brands in the conference, perceived premier brands in the conference to leverage their actual worth to the conference and get what they deserve, quite frankly. So, and it will help. Ultimately, it helps the ACC because, one of the things that they haven't done in the history of their conference is really promote their biggest brands, especially in football. I mean, it's always been a basketball conference, and the ACC leadership, and obviously that's changed a lot in the last couple of years. So now, the ACC is in an interesting spot. They're kind of in a PR nightmare because in the two biggest sports, they're perceived as a joke, and
Yep.
a lot of it is their doing. So now, they've got to do something to get your biggest brands in the most, advantageous positions possible, and not worry about and also preserve the stability of the conference for the lesser programs, or the lesser invested programs, I should say. And so for them to be getting the same piece of the pie that, when Clemson and SMU make the playoff, and like, imagine if all of that money, the $4 million that both of those schools made from making the playoffs, was just thrown into the pool of money that is distributed to all teams. Like, that doesn't seem fair.
Right.
So, those kinds of things, I think you're going to see change.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And look, from a standpoint of, we're Clemson fans, obviously, we welcome the uneven distribution because it's going to help Clemson get a little bit more money. Now, are Clemson, Florida State, Miami, North Carolina, whoever you want to name as the bigger brands of the ACC, is some quote unquote brand fund that the ACC is going to set aside money, and the uneven revenue distribution and the restructuring of postseason success and how that contributes to what slice of the money you get and what slice of the money you don't get. Is that really going to bridge the gap between the ACC, the top programs in the ACC, what they make, and what the SEC and the Big Ten programs make? Absolutely not. We're not going to get anywhere close to it. It's not going to happen. But any extra that we can get other than what we get now, it helps sustain in the meantime until we get to the final destination of whatever this college football structure is going to end up being. It's not a done deal. I think you bring up an interesting point with the 2030, 2031 date where all the media contracts are up. That might be a pivotal time in restructuring of college football. There might be mass movement between conferences and conference realignment and big brands moving here and there and all over the place. Who knows what that ultimately ends up looking like? But I do think that's probably an important date along the way, along the timeline of this 2036 ultimate expiring of the ACC contract with ESPN. I don't think college football looks anything like it does right now in 2036. That's all I'm going to say. Where Clemson ends up, where Florida State ends up, where Miami ends up, where North Carolina ends up, where North Carolina State ends up, where all these bigger brands in the ACC end up, I don't exactly know. Will there be a two-conference type deal? Will it be the SEC and the Big Ten, or will all those conference names go away and it's something completely different that gets restructured? And does major college football break away from the NCAA totally and have a commissioner and run it like that? Who knows what it's going to look like? But I think it looks a lot different in 2031 than it does right now. And I think in the meantime, schools like Florida State and Clemson are just trying to buy their time and get as much money from the conference as they possibly can. And I really can't blame them. They're trying to keep up from a competitive standpoint with schools that are going to be making 30 plus, 40 plus $1 million more than them a year. And that's hard to keep up with. They're going to have to get creative. How they get it done, I don't know. But if in exchange for dropping a lawsuit, you get them to significantly drop the buyout to that 2031 date, I think it's worth it, right? And the lawsuit probably did exactly what you wanted it to do. You got what you wanted, right? Essentially. We're not behind the scenes. A lot of people have speculated about, Clemson's going to be out here, Florida State's going to be out this year, so on and so forth, right? But in my opinion, just a fan outside looking in, if Clemson were to get a significant drop in the buyout in 2031, where it would be a feasible number, whatever that number is, where it would be physically doable to get out of the conference then in exchange for dropping the current lawsuit against the ACC, I think that's a win. An even further win if you get the uneven revenue distribution and that quote-unquote brand fund whatever that's going to look like. So I think that's where we're at with it. Obviously, it's not ideal. Clemson doesn't want to operate at a deficit from now until 2031, possibly, or possibly further. But honestly, I don't know what choice we have other than to try to leverage that lawsuit and get the ACC to change the way that they distribute the funds around the conference.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, like the ACC needs to do something about it. So like they have incentive, like not just from the lawsuit and keeping,
Yeah.
that, I mean, that PR thing in check. It really is a matter of, okay, our public perception is at an all-time low, which is crazy to say, because, the football, in football, the ACC has never been a really respected conference. But now
Right.
with, like I said, with basketball obviously trending in the wrong direction, with a lot of their biggest brands not playing well outside of Duke, like we need to make sure that we have the two cash cows of college athletics. We need to put our best foot forward as far as promoting our brands and making sure that they're in a position to succeed. Because ultimately, when Clemson does well, when Florida State does well, when Miami does well, when North Carolina does well, name the schools that you think of as the cream of the crop in the ACC in terms of a brand standpoint. That's when the conference is at its best. That's when they get the most respect. Ultimately, that's what the ACC needs to do, and they need to take those steps, whatever it takes, to make sure that they're promoting their best brands moving forward, because they throughout their history they just have not done a good job at that.
Yeah, I mean, look, nobody's out here saying that the ACC has ever been run very, very well. They're always reactionary. They're never forward facing in anything. They're never leading the way in any sort of changes within any sport. So it's no surprise that the ACC finds themselves at a complete disadvantage when it comes to their TV contract and the money that they can provide to their institutions. And their job as a conference is to put their institutions in the best possible place to compete at the highest level. And on every turn, basically, they have failed to do so. I don't know what they do going forward. It's a little late when it comes to the media contract. I mean, ESPN's basically got you till 2036, and they don't have to pay you a dime more. Anyways, whatever. It's unfortunate. And it's the member institutions like Clemson, like Florida State, like North Carolina, like Georgia Tech, whoever you want to name, that suffer from just the lack of leadership at the highest levels in the ACC conference. Hopefully, we get a little bit of restructuring to get us at least somewhat closer to some of the other big dogs, but that remains to be seen how much money it will actually be.